Hello, everyone. This is the May webinar presented by the Essex County branch of Ontario Ancestors. My name is Linda Urquhart, and I will be your host for tonight. Pat Clancy will be monitoring the questions. Thanks to her for that. Okay, I'm having trouble with...
Just move, there you go.
Yeah, sorry. Before we start, I just wanted to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home, including the first inhabitants of Essex County. The Anishinaabe group, part of the Three Fires Confederacy, comprising the bands Potawatomi, Ottawa, and Ojibwa or Chippewa, as well as the Huron or Wendat or Wyandot bands. We must all acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and consider how we can each, in our own way, try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So thanks for joining us. We hope you are enjoying the warmer weather. Just a reminder that this presentation is being recorded and will be added to our YouTube channel. Also, everyone is muted and your camera is turned off during the presentation. Questions will be answered following the presentation. Just add your questions as we go along to the chat box, and you should add them to Pat Clancy or to Ontario Ancestors, whichever you prefer. And if you just hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that chat box there. We will be adding a handout to the chat box during the presentation. For those who are first-time visitors to our webinars, we are one of the 35 branches or special interest groups of Ontario Ancestors, also known as the Ontario Genealogical Society, which is the largest member-supported genealogical organization in Canada. It was founded in 1961 with its mission to encourage, bring together, and assist those interested in the pursuit of family history and to preserve Ontario's genealogical heritage. We are the Essex County branch of Ontario Ancestors. And here are the links that we show every webinar, but it is useful to visit them periodically as new things are added all the time. Feel free to take a screenshot. The first link is to our parent organization, Ontario Ancestors, where you will find many Ontario resources. Just add your ancestor's name to the search bar and see what you find. Next is the link to the Essex Branch website, which has Essex County resources, including our members' library, packed full of local resources. Other links include our YouTube channel, where you can review past presentations. We always encourage you to interact with us by joining our Facebook group and following us on Twitter and Instagram. Here are some upcoming webinars that you might find interesting. Tomorrow, the Scottish SIG is presenting a look at Kirk session records. On Thursday, the Lambton branch is offering Meet the Alberta Genealogical Society. This Friday, the Kent branch will host resources for the family historian at the Chatham-Kent Public Library. Next Monday, the Sudbury branch will talk about discovering the power of Wikitree. And don't forget that on Tuesday, May 31st at 2 p.m., there will be another chat with the Family Tree Maker user group. And for other webinars, check out the events calendar at the Ontario Ancestors website. You can find it under the Education tab. And just a reminder to save the date for the Ontario Ancestors Conference 2022, which will again be virtual. The theme of the conference is the past, the present, and the future. It will be hosted by the Ottawa branch on June 24th to the 26th. There will be a My Heritage Day on Friday and 28 presentations over 2 streams on Saturday and Sunday. Registration is now open, and you can go to that website, conference2022.ogs.on.ca. We also wanted to let you know that our featured resource on the website this month is the Windsor Star Obituaries 1973 to 1976. This opens 16 files of obituaries sorted in alphabetic order. Many more obituaries are available in the members' library, including the Botsford collection, the Essex branch collection, and more years from the Windsor Star. We will be changing this featured resource monthly to give you an idea of what you, as a member of the branch, can find in the members' library. We will soon enter the summer break when the Essex branch does not offer any more educational presentations, but we assume that everyone will be enjoying the June OGS conference, as well as the many summer activities available to us in Essex County. Our cemetery team will continue to meet on Wednesday mornings at Windsor Grove for those interested in helping. And we have a summer student who will be assisting us in our indexing project, as well as scanning some more materials from the library collection. We will be back in September, and our September webinar will be presented by Monica Carruthers and Perry Basden of Colchester Heritage, who will discuss the life and times of the Colchester Schoolhouse. You will be able to register for this on our website starting tomorrow, and we will remind you about it on our Facebook group as well as in our monthly e-trails. And now for tonight's presentation, joining us is Dr. Laura Smith, who will be presenting Early Irish in Essex County. And just a few words introducing Laura. Laura J. Smith is a historian of the Irish in early Canada. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Toronto. Her dissertation looked at the religious and political lives of Irish Catholic migrants and settlers in Upper Canada before 1840. She is published in various peer-reviewed academic journals and edited collections on Irish Catholic migration and political activism in Upper Canada, and more recently on the reception and management of Irish famine migrants to Ontario in the 1840s. She is the Vice President of the Canadian Catholic Historical Association and the co-editor of Borealia, a blog about early Canadian history. And you can see the URL there, earlycanadianhistory.ca. She is a historical consultant for the Canada-Ireland Foundation, where she was the historian for the recently opened Grasset Park and is now leading the Tracing the Irish Famine Generation in Ontario project. So with that, I'll pass it over to Laura.
Thank you, Linda. I'll just get my screen organized here. Now, can anyone see my slide?
Looks good.
Thank you. I gave a presentation a few months ago and completely just launched into it, and they had to interrupt me and say, we can't see anything. And it's funny because I've always thought it was sort of a silly thing to ask if anyone could see your slides, because clearly it is an issue. So here we are. Thank you, Linda, for that great introduction. I'm so pleased to be invited to speak to the Essex County OGS branch this evening. I love talking to genealogical societies because I inevitably learn something. I feel as though I take more from these exchanges than I give. So hopefully I can offer something of interest tonight, and also hopefully I learned something new. I want to warn everyone, I'm here with my two sons, my little boys this evening, and usually my husband would be here, but he's not. So if I get interrupted, please have a little bit of patience. They've been given free reign with the video game system, so hopefully we won't see much of them. But nevertheless, it's a possibility. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research interests. Linda already touched on it a little bit, but it's a way of introducing how I came to look at Irish migrants in Essex County. And I should note that I'm looking at Irish Catholic migrants in Essex County. And it's kind of okay because for what I found is that the Irish in Essex County, were almost predominantly Roman Catholic. So I'm covering the population fairly well by just looking at Catholics. So I'll give a very brief overview of the history of Essex County. and then get into what I've discovered about the earliest Irish Catholic settlement in the area, which would have been in the 1820s. And then if we have time, maybe we can talk a little bit about researching the Irish in Ontario in general. I haven't actually prepared any notes on that subject, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions or discuss some of my other projects on that front. And so, as Linda noted, I'm a historian for the Canada Ireland Foundation. As she said, I provide historical research and content for the Foundation's various projects. And those have included Gresset Park, as Linda mentioned, which is in the entertainment district in downtown Toronto. It's on the site of the first hospital in Toronto. And during the Irish famine in the 1840s, and particularly in 1847, that site, that general hospital, was used as an immigrant hospital, and it received thousands of Irish immigrants in 1847. And so Gresset Park is on that site, and it's there to commemorate the medical workers who perished that summer tending to Irish migrants. Right now, I'm working on a plaque installation that will be put on the Toronto waterfront that will commemorate the 175th anniversary of the famine, the penultimate year of the famine, that 1847 year, which is this year. And so these plaques are going to be installed on the waterfront, and they just tell the general story of the Irish famine for the Canadian context, but also with some specificity for Toronto. We're also hoping to put plaques in Ottawa and in other sites across the country this summer. And those plaques will be on the waterfront in the vicinity of Ireland Park, which is the Foundation's signature and first and sort of premier park in Toronto, and that's the Famine Memorial Park. And if you haven't had a chance to get to downtown Toronto, next time you're there, it's just opposite the Billy Bishop Airport, right on the waterfront, and it's quite dramatic, very evocative and emotional sculpture, and a lovely memorial wall where we've carved the names of men and women and children who died that summer in Toronto. And actually, as part of the 175th anniversary, we're going to add 50 or 60 more names that I've unearthed in my research. So that's pretty exciting. I also, as Linda said, leading the Tracing Famine Generation project. I've added a link on the handout to our sort of rudimentary page on the Foundation website that includes a video of a presentation that I've been giving. Some of you may have seen it already, but because I've given it to other genealogical societies in Ontario in the last year. But if you have any interest in that project, the video is there, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about it after. So, while most of my research has been focused on the famine, so most of my research, for the Canada Ireland Foundation has been concentrated on the famine Irish. My academic research, particularly my dissertation for my PhD, was on Irish Catholics in Upper Canada. So from approximately 1820, when they first start to appear in the province, to 1840. I purposely stopped before the famine because I thought it was kind of messy and complicated, and it was easier to stop. And again, on the handout, I put a link to my unpublished dissertation, which is available online. It's super long, but if you're interested, you might take a look at it. Maybe one day I'll publish it in a shorter, more concise form, but there it is right now. Some of the material I'll talk about tonight for Essex County is in there, but there's also lots of discussion of other elements of Irish Catholic religion, religious practices, and politics, predominantly in that 1820 to 1840 period. So Essex County, forgive the quality of this map, it's a little blurry. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that Essex County is a super fascinating, rich site for historical interest. It's one of the oldest areas of European settlement in Ontario, and it has an even longer history of Indigenous presence, as Linda mentioned. And I think it's also a fascinating place to study Roman Catholicism in Canada and in Ontario. So as Linda mentioned, the Indigenous communities of Wendat or Wyandotte, the people that the French called the Huron, rather, they were found in the vicinity of Amherstburg. And Anishinaabe people, the Ottawa, amongst others, were also in the vicinity of Windsor in the 19th century. And it's kind of interesting because the earliest Roman Catholic presence in Essex County, or at least the earliest church in Essex County, a church I'll talk quite a bit about, Our Lady of the Assumption in Windsor, or what was Sandwich, was built at the behest of the Wendat people. They asked and supported the building of this church because they were Christian and Roman Catholic, for that matter. So it's sort of an exciting place to study sort of the interactions of different groups with the church. And I'm sure you all know the first European settlers in the region were French. They were former soldiers who had come from Fort Detroit, Fort Pontchartrain, in what is now Michigan. And they started to settle the eastern side of the Detroit River in the late 1740s. And you can see their settlement patterns on this map at the top left corner. That classic traditional rang, the river lot, these long, narrow strips that extend from the riverfront 10, 15 kilometers into the interior. So that is evidence of French settlement. And there was quite a significant and persistent French presence in Essex County from the 18th century. And obviously it still lingers in place names and street names and things like that in the area. The American Revolution also brought loyalist settlers to the area in the 18th century, and these were a multicultural group. We have Hessians, we have Pennsylvania Dutch Mennonites, and others. And then in the early 19th century, the inland area, the interior of away from the riverfront, was surveyed, and the Talbot Road was built. And I'm sure all of you, if you actually live in this area, have driven this road. It is obviously still there today. I don't know whether you can see my mouse, but it comes all the way diagonal from Windsor at the top, or Sandwich at the time, all the way down to Point Pelee. And it followed the route of a glacial moraine. And this route, the Talbot Road, was the primary point, or the orientation point, for the next stage of European settlement in the area. And it allowed surveyors to open up additional townships, such as Maidstone, Rochester, and so on. And so despite all these new arrivals, the Roman Catholic presence in Essex County remained strong. A study of the 1851 census for Essex County shows that actually Essex County had on average fewer Protestant denominations, Methodists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, and far greater concentrations of Roman Catholics and Baptists than was the provincial norm. I mean, like, Ontario is a profoundly Protestant place in the 19th century, but Essex County is a little different, which makes it kind of interesting. And so, though the area is under British rule from the 1760s, the Francophone population, as I said, it persists. And it's ministered to by French-speaking Jesuits who are stationed at Sandwich. And they're the ones who built that church at Sandwich, what would become Assumption. And that church came to form the nucleus of the Roman Catholic community, at least in the northern half of Essex County. And it's to this parish and community that the Irish immigrants who I want to talk about came in the mid-1820s, sorry. And here's a great, I don't know whether you can see, hopefully everyone can see this, but a great painting of the original church of Our Lady of the Assumption. The present day church is not the original, but you can see it here, right on the water, essentially where the Ambassador Bridge is now. There is a church there now, but you can see it there. So when I set out to do my dissertation, I had wanted to study the religious practices of Irish Catholic immigrants and settlers in Upper Canada. I wanted to know, in pre-famine Ireland, religion or Catholicism was in flux. Historians had found that once the famine had finished, there was this devotional revolution. Catholicism became more widespread. Widespread practices of Catholicism were embraced by the laity. The church kind of consolidated as authority, and Ireland became that cliche devout Catholic country. But in the pre-famine period, that had not been the case. And it was mostly because, for lots of reasons, but one of the main reasons was the church just simply, you know, there's government issues, there's legality issues, but also it just doesn't have the resources to have any sort of hold over the people. And there's also persistence of folk beliefs, and that's something I'll talk about in a little bit. But so I wanted to know, you know, what did Irish immigrants bring with them? What did Irish Catholic immigrants bring from their religion in Ireland? Historians were telling me that religion in Ireland at the time was very landscape-based, was very home-based. There was a lot of pagan influences. And so I wanted to know, did people bring that to Canada? And if they did, how did it change once it was in Canada? And this was a pretty difficult thing to research, as I'm sure you can all imagine. So my first point of call was the archives of the Roman Catholic Diocese of London, partly because I had a friend who had just gotten a job at King's University at Western, and I had a free place to stay. But I learned, to my dismay, almost within 10 minutes of arriving at this archives, that all the clerical correspondence for the Southwestern Ontario, the Catholic Church in Southwestern Ontario, wasn't held there. It was in Kingston, which is where the original diocese was. And so the archivist was quite enterprising. She didn't want me to waste my day, so she gave me the parish register for Assumption, for Our Lady of Assumption at Sandwich. And I was a little doubtful. I'd never seen a parish register before. I didn't know, you know, how I would use this. I had yet to understand the amazing resources that genealogists use in their work. As a historian, I'd very much, you know, the sort of thread of history in which I've been trained did not engage with these sorts of sources at all. So I didn't know what I was looking at. A big book, French names down the margin, French text, very difficult to understand. And I kind of just sort of flipped through it, like thinking, well, what is this? What can I do with this? But as I got through the book, I started to see the occasional Anglophone last name. Or rather, I was seeing Anglophone last names and French first names. And these were often Scots men marrying French Canadian women, or in the odd case, an Irish man marrying a French Canadian woman. And so here's an example. It's not a marriage, and it's one of the earlier, I'm guessing you can't read this, the script, but I'll interpret as much as I can. So this is Marie Cecile McMullen. And so she's baptized at Assumption on the 23rd of January, 1825. And it says that she was born to the legitimate marriage of Patrick McMullen and Marie Capillard. So here we have someone who is clearly, the father is very clearly has an Irish name, and the mother very clearly has a French name. So I started seeing names like this, which was kind of interesting to me. But as I got closer and closer to the second half of the 1820s, I saw more and more Irish names, Irish last names appearing, and fewer of these mixed, so-called mixed marriages, I would call them. And so having no experience of a parish register, as I said, it took me a little while to understand what I was looking at. And so here's another example. This is Margaret McCarthy. I'm going to assume that her parents had named her Margaret, but you'll find that in the Assumption Register, the priests are writing in French, and they will write as much as they can in French. And so often they Frenchify the Irish people's names. But what's interesting about this one is, so she's baptized on the 9th of March in 1825. She's baptized under condition, which says something. But it says she's born in the legitimate marriage of Charles McCarthy. Oh, there's a typo there. But Charles McCarthy and Marie McCarthy, who I would assume is Mary McCarthy. And it explicitly says that these people are Irish. And it says that they're now established in this parish. So that's interesting. I mean, the priest is marking them as different, but also indicating that they've been included in this community. The idea that she's baptized under condition, I'm sure I don't need to tell everybody here, but and everyone will likely have maybe correct me, but as I understand it, it means that she's likely been baptized at home already, and this is the priest redoing that. And that's something that Irish settlers in Upper Canada often did. If you didn't know when you were going to see a priest next, the midwife or the local woman who might have delivered the baby, or one of the father of the child, might baptize the child at home, sort of as a stopgap measure until they can find a priest. So I started seeing more and more of these entries, as I said. And so what I was finding was, and it's funny, I was thinking about it before we came on this call, that as genealogists, you often are looking for individual people. And I kind of came at it from a different way. I used a genealogical source and found a group of people and have been looking at them as a group rather than as individuals. And I think in my next stage of this project, I'll start to draw on the genealogy to supplement what I found for this group. But nevertheless, what I found was the emergence of a concentrated Irish Catholic community within Assumption Parish. So beginning in 1825, at least in the register, and continuing for 2 decades, in this register, we see religious practice, we see interconnected relationships of Irish from various areas in Ireland. They're baptizing their children, they're seeing and supporting their friends and relatives as they marry, and they're burying their loved ones. And in the process, I think what they're building is a cohesive community within the larger parish. So there's still a lot of still have a lot of question marks about these earliest arrivals. And if I'm being totally honest, I had sort of dropped this project until Cindy, I actually made a throwaway comment about the Irish in Essex County at another presentation, and Cindy kind of Robichaud jumped on it and said, hey, let's chat. But I'm really excited to start looking at these people again, because they seem to have interesting and different trajectories as they come to Canada, or rather to Essex County. So as I said, there's still a lot of question marks about what's going on here. And I peek at Ancestry now and then, but at the moment, but I'm still trying to stick with my data set, if that makes any sense. But there's some evidence in the genealogy family trees that I see that some of these Irish came from County Cork, and they came via New York. So that's interesting to me. There's also some evidence or rather anecdotal discussion that many of the Irish who came in those first couple of years, 1825 up to maybe 1828, were disbanded soldiers who had received their land for free from the government. And that's very common for the Irish in Upper Canada. The Irish were a huge, Irish Catholics, Irish Protestants, a huge subsection of the British Army in the 18th and 19th centuries. Absolutely, it was a valid and popular employment choice for Irish men, Protestant or Catholic, and many of them used that as a means to gain access to land in Upper Canada. So what we do know is that the parish priest at Assumption wrote to the Bishop of Upper Canada, whose name was Alexander MacDonnell, who was stationed in Kingston. He wrote to him in the mid-1820s and said, there are 20 Irish families who have just arrived here. And he's kind of nervous because he says, I don't speak English, and I don't know how to help these people. I don't know how to interact with them. So his first solution is send me an English-speaking priest, please. These people, I can't help them, or I can't communicate with them. But as I'll talk about later on in the presentation, there are not a lot of English-speaking priests in Upper Canada at the time, so that wasn't going to happen. So the next thing the priest says is, well, at least send me some English catechisms so I can try to give them something to read. I can try to learn English, but it's a source of sort of tension for the priest. He's very nervous about it. He sees it as he's at a disadvantage, and I'll talk a little bit in a minute about why and how that sort of came to fruition. So we know that the Irish Catholics, I put a star here. This is Maidstone Cross. It's now, Maidstone. They predominantly settled in Sandwich Township along this Talbot Road and into Maidstone Township. And why they settled there and why they picked that area is, again, one of those question marks. John Clark, whose book I provided a reference to in the handout, says that he doesn't really know why the Irish settled where they did. And he speculates that they picked that spot because they were given a free grant of land, and then, that's, you just take what you're given sort of thing. He also suggests that in Essex County, there was already an established tradition of settling with your with those of your common ethnicity, of common language and religion. And sort of the French had set that pattern up. And so possibly this is the Irish also choosing to settle that way. I also think there's some argument to be made to the proximity to the church here. Assumption is up here at the top, and this is sort of as close as they can get to Assumption. And that's again, a very common strategy on the part of Irish immigrants or really any immigrants in Upper Canada. Religion is incredibly important. And so proximity to church is an attractive feature when it comes to picking land. And you would often see ads in the newspaper that said, 10 miles to the church or whatever when someone was selling land. So it is a feature, and it's probably part of why they ended up where they did. And Maidstone, at least, is about 20 kilometers from Assumption. So not great, not a terrible distance now, but nevertheless a significant one. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm gonna keep going. What I see in the parish register, I'm gonna start to talk a little bit about the patterns I see in the parish register that tell us about what the Irish Catholic community in Assumption were about. We can see in the register that they kept to themselves. They married each other with a very few exceptions. They are witnesses at each other's funerals. And most significantly, they only selected godparents from within the Irish community. There are almost no French names as godparents after 1825 for Irish children being baptized. And I think that's really interesting. Irish also appear to have never sought or assumed positions of leadership at Assumption Parish. There are no Irish names in the records of the Fabrique, which would have been the Church Warden Council at Assumption. It's clear that instead they focused on that Maidstone settlement. And eventually they constructed a small chapel there in the mid-1830s. So it's clear that, they decided to, religion is incredibly important to them, but they focus on that Irish community instead, rather than trying to, work with or join the French kind of cohort at Assumption. At the time, frequent mass would not have been, you would not have gone to mass every week. Rosemary Halford, in her history of Maidstone Parish, she talks about them walking to Assumption through swamps and carrying their shoes so their shoes don't get dirty. That would have happened, infrequently. At the time, Catholics were more likely to do their Easter duty, as they say, so receive Eucharist during Lent and make a confession at the same time. And so Mass would not have been a weekly thing. But I think the register shows that they absolutely made the trip to Assumption when a child needed to be baptized. You'll remember Marie Cecile McMullen. She was baptized on the morning of her birth. So that suggests to me that mixed couple, French and Irish couple, were close to Assumption. But Margaret McCarthy, was baptized under condition, suggesting there was a time between her baptism and in the church. So she's a little bit at a distance, right? The other thing we know about this community is the parish priest, despite the fact that he couldn't communicate with them, he really thought that they were the most devout people. Like, compared to the French Canadians of Assumption, he thought the Irish were fantastic. He writes to the bishop and says, these people are so devoted to the religion. That's common too. The other French priests at in Chatham and in those areas also say the same things about Irish Catholics at the time. So I think, we can see a clear interest in community, in religious practice, and in interconnectedness of the community in the parish. So as part of my research, using the Assumption Register, I built a database of Irish names from the register from 1825 into the 1850s. I really should have stopped earlier, but I just couldn't help myself. As I'm sure genealogists will know, you just one more record, you just keep looking. And so my analysis of this data is absolutely still a work in progress, but one of the things, I started to see some emerging patterns, and I'm hoping to pursue this a little bit further. As I said, I haven't gone into the genealogy of these people or these individuals much. I'm trying to see what patterns come out of the data first. But I know there are some remarkably rich family trees for the Maidstone Irish that are shared online on Ancestry and Family Search and places like that. So most of the Irish individuals in the Assumption Register appear once, they appear twice. They're having a child baptized, or they're standing up as godparent to another child. And the majority of the events associated with the Irish are absolutely baptisms, which, speaks to the age of settlement for sure. But in a significant number of individuals who I've listed here, there are 23 names here. These are people who appear in 10 or more events. And by events, I mean sacraments. So a baptism, a funeral, a burial, a marriage. These are people whose names appear, whether they are a parent, a godparent, a witness, or a participant, a bride or groom, or what have you. And what's really interesting, what I've started to discover, is that most of these people are members of the first Irish families in the region, or at least were in this area before 1830. And so that's just, sorry, need a drink of water. So that suggests to me that they are leaders within the community, that these people have presence, they are longstanding figures in the community, and people are, their presence at a sacrament is sought after, that you might that they're being purposely chosen as godparents for newborn children, particularly in cases you often see in cases of newcomers to the community. They would have chosen someone who had presence, or who had who's a significant member of the community, and that would help them foster and cement connections with the new community. So a couple of caveats. I have an asterisk on Jeremiah McCarthy. There's a couple of Jeremiah McCarthys who, and it's been enough time since I compiled this data that I don't know if I trust myself that it's the same Jeremiah McCarthy. It's possibly not. But I will note that these events are also sacraments in which they themselves are participants. So we have a couple of adult conversions here, or their own weddings or their own baptisms. And so I'm going to talk about one person in particular to sort of illustrate that, and particularly the experience of women. As you may have noticed from this list, there aren't very many women on this list, and I think that's really interesting. And actually, one of the things I've discovered is Catherine Flynn, Elizabeth Flynn, they're the wives of men on this list. And so that's something I haven't managed to unpack yet, but I think it's interesting. So Anne Halford, I know the Halford name is a big one in Essex County and around Maidstone. And as I said, they're longstanding Irish Maidstone family. Anne Halford was the daughter of John Halford and Mary O'Brien, who Ancestry tells me came from County Meath. And Anne, though she was a young woman when she came to Essex County, is one of the earliest Irish female figures in the parish register. Now, I included this image, and because it's almost always tied to her in ancestry family trees, but she died when she was 44, so I'm not sure if that is her, but nevertheless, it's a great image. But I think Anne Halford is a great illustration of some of the patterns of female participation in the register. She's fairly active as a godmother and witness at weddings of her friends. But after her own marriage in 1833, her participation is then as a mother of her baptized children. And it suggests to me that being a godmother, or even being a maybe not actually, no, I won't say being a godfather. Being a godmother, at least, was the purview of a younger woman. But it was also that young people's participation in this community began as young adults. It didn't happen after they were married. There are often people serving as godparents before they themselves are married or having their own children. It's another example of Michael Dalton. And I think it's really interesting. He's the godfather to Susan Goodbody on the 1st of November, 1826. But then he marries Susan's sister, Margaret, on the 28th of November. And so to me, this sort of speaks to that godparent relationship as a way of introducing or incorporating someone new to the family, or of sort of starting to foment, foster, or make those connections with a newcomer to the family and possibly to the community. So I think that's a really interesting pattern that's starting to emerge from my reading of this parish register. Michael McCarthy is someone who I absolutely want to know more about. The Maidstone Parish History by Rosemary Halford makes reference to a biography written about him. And if someone out there knows where I can find this, I would be eternally grateful. But we know that Michael McCarthy came from Cork by way of New York. His brothers were in the settlement as well. And he makes his first appearance in the Assumption Register as a witness at a funeral for a Mary Burchell, who is listed as the wife of Daniel Driscoll, and that's in December 1825. So we know he's in the settlement before that. And then for the next 25 years, he participates in more than 20 sacrament events, and only 5 of those are the baptisms of his own children. So to me, that suggests that he is a person of prominence in the community. I see him almost as a hub, and I would love, and I really wanted to try and do it for tonight, but I didn't get a chance, just to visualize the interconnectedness and sort of the spokes coming out of Michael McCarthy and all the different elements and people he was connected to through these religious events. So I'm running out of time. I realize that, but I've got one more story to tell. So I'm sure you can appreciate, we see this interconnectedness, I hope, this community building that's happening of Irish Catholic settlers in Sandwich Township. I see this, there's an insulation, like they're insulated, they're isolated to a certain extent, but they're purposely keeping themselves separate. And it's clear that a church, they built their own chapel in the 1830s. Their church and a resident priest for Maidstone is a natural goal that the community worked toward. And they eventually received a resident priest in the mid-1820s, but that was not before a little bit of drama. And here's a picture of the current Maidstone Church. I'll put that there. So I'm going to ruin my story a little bit, but I feel like a little background information is important. Essex County is actually one of the few places in the province that had a resident Roman Catholic priest in the 1820s. It's kind of special for that reason. And in the 1820s, we have this influx of Irish Catholic immigrants to Upper Canada. And they speak Irish, but they also speak English. And the church comes quickly to realize that they just do not, it just does not have the resources to support a large scale influx of English speaking Catholics. They have the resources to support French Catholics in Southwestern Ontario and Essex County. There's Scots Catholics in Eastern Ontario. And there are plenty of Scottish-born priests being generated by that community to support that community. They're fine. But this influx of English-speaking Irish is a problem. There are not enough English-speaking priests. There are definitely not enough Irish priests. And so Irish priests were sort of highly sought after. They're in high demand in Upper Canada in the 1820s. And what's interesting is there's actually quite a few. There's a surplus of priests in Ireland at the same time, almost as like there's a surplus of people, as there is. And so there are quite a lot of Irish priests coming to Upper Canada as immigrants. They come with their families. They just happen to be priests. And so many of them start to present themselves to the bishop with or without their credentials. Not everyone came with credentials, unfortunately. And they're looking for employment, as every Irish person who came to Upper Canada at the time was. And the bishop, Alexander MacDonnell, he's just desperate. He wants to hire anyone. He just legitimate credentials. He hires people with the promise that they'll get their credentials from Ireland at some point. That doesn't always happen. But the key piece is he needs people who are willing to work for next to nothing in a remote settlement. And many Irish priests are happy to do that. And in many respects, it's because they're sort of the ideal candidates for that. Irish priests at the time were independent, they're mobile, they're used to working in a landscape, a religious context where there's very little money, very few churches or any sort of religious infrastructure. And Upper Canada is the same. It's actually quite familiar to them. And so they actually work quite well in this area until they don't. And unfortunately, there are some who are incompetent, there are some who are intemperate, and there are just some who just can't stand the fact that they maybe don't know where their next meal is coming from, or they can't afford a coat for the winter. And so some of these priests start to get in trouble, and they're outside the bishop's surveillance. He can't keep track of them. He doesn't know what they're up to. He might get a letter from them once a year. He doesn't know what's going on. And so often he doesn't catch on that there's anything wrong, but sometimes he does, and he would suspend them. Usually when things had gotten really bad. There's a lot that the priest could have gotten away with before the bishop was willing to suspend them. But nevertheless, he starts to be really wary of newly arrived priests and starts to decline to employ them. And this is happening all over North America. This is super common. Great letters from bishops all over North America saying, Irish Catholic priests are just incompetent. Anyway, but I digress. So what's happening in Upper Canada is these suspended priests, they're dismissed from employment in the diocese. They just keep working because nobody can stop them, really. The bishop, he doesn't know what they're up to. He didn't know what they were up to when they were in his good graces, and he definitely doesn't know what they're up to now. And so there's this kind of cohort of Irish priests who are roaming Upper Canada, performing sacraments for income and saying mass for income. And the bishop had no idea, or if he did, there was nothing he could do about it. And so, they could walk the walk, they could talk the talk. And for the most part, they counted on, that unreliable communication network. People didn't know, the bishop didn't know what they were up to. And often the laity, who were so isolated, were so eager to see a priest in their midst. They didn't think to question the priest's credentials, or at least that's what the bishop thought. He spends a lot of ink bemoaning the fate of Irish Catholics who are left to the wolves, these Irish priests who prey on them like wolves. But the Irish in Assumption in Sandwich are entirely different. And I think it's because I'm still kind of trying to get at why. It's something about their isolation within the parish, their faith, their ardent desire to have their own priest, and maybe their relationship with that French population, and particularly the French-speaking priests at Assumption. Because in the late 1830s and the early 1840s, they allowed itinerant fraudulent priests to say mass in their chapel at Maidstone. And so one of the things I want to note is that itinerant fraudulent priests are actually a feature of Irish Catholicism in the 17th and early 19th century. And it's something that actually they would have been quite comfortable with, or would have understood. I know I'm running out of time, but there was a tradition of suspended priests. They're called couple beggars. And here's a great illustration on the slide of sort of what the impression of these men were. And they kind of exploited some ambiguity about the legality of marriage at the time. They also exploited the fact that Irish people, or Irish Catholics and before the famine, they're kind of casual about that sacrament of marriage. Sacrament of baptism and last rites are super important, but marriage, it's not that important. And there was this belief amongst the Irish peasantry that once a priest was ordained, the bishop or the pope, nobody could deprive him of his spiritual authority, and consequently his right of conferring sacraments. And there was even this idea that a suspended priest in particular gained sort of powers, that they had healing powers. And so there's these stories, these folk stories about these lone nomadic priests who were kind of fallen out of grace with the bishop, who could bestow favors on lay people who helped him, who gave him food and drink and shelter. And so these stories would have come to Upper Canada. So it kind of explains why Irish Catholics, whether they knew it or not, were happy enough to help or listen to a priest whose credentials were a little ambiguous. So in in Assumption Parish, we get a man named Manigan who arrives in 1839. Mannigan was already known to Bishop MacDonnell. He had presented himself in 1833 in Kingston looking for a job. But MacDonnell, surprisingly, because this rarely happened, had already heard about him. He was notorious. He had heard he'd been fired from the Diocese of New York, and he absolutely refused to employ him, which doesn't usually happen. Usually he took people on, even if he'd heard questionable things about them. So Bishop MacDonnell says, no, thank you, Mannigan. Kind of ironically, he says to him, maybe you should go to the Diocese of Boston. I hear they're looking for priests. So we don't really know what happened to him after that. But in Essex County in May of 1839, Mannigan appears, and he attempted to pass himself off as a priest in Sandwich. And according to the parish priest at the time, Augustin Vervet at Assumption, everyone knew. Vervet invited Mannigan to dinner, and he said that I subjected him to intense questioning on subjects of dogma and theology, and I knew right away that he was not a priest. But the Irish in Maidstone didn't seem to care, and they allowed him to say mass in their chapel. And Vervet is absolutely astonished, but also upset, because he knows that this is part of this tension. You know, he doesn't speak English, and he knows that the Irish in his parish need an English-speaking priest. And then again in 1841, another Irishman, unfortunately we don't know this one's name, arrived at Sandwich, and he claimed to have been appointed as parish priest to Sandwich. And of course, the priest at the time is like, you know, astonished. And he reports to the bishop and says, I don't know who this guy is, but the Irish in the parish at Maidstone are supporting him. You know, they're completely ignoring his credentials. They know he's a fraud, but they don't seem to care. And so actually we get this event where the Irish arrive at Assumption Parish because they want vestments and a chalice for this man to use. And the priest has to physically bar the door to not allow them to come in. So, I mean, I just love this episode. I think it's so interesting. It says so much about the religious, you know, I'd say if anything, it points to the degree of how important their engagement with the church was. It's sort of ironic when you think about it, but the degree to which they craved a relationship with their priest and the presence of an English-speaking priest within their midst. The priests at Assumption were too far away, you know, not even just physically, but in terms of language and culture. And they wanted something, these Irish Catholics wanted something more substantial in their relationship. And so perhaps provoked by this episode, they actually were given an Irish English speaking priest not long after, but his name was Father Michael McDonnell. But unfortunately, according to the Maidstone parish history, he found pioneer life unsuitable and was recalled by the bishop in 1844. Thank you so much. I hope that was interesting, and I hope everyone learned something, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions or hear any comments about the subject.
Thank you so much, Laura, especially the information about these fraudulent priests sure added a lot.
Such a great story.
A lot of interest. We've got a couple questions. One relates to that, and he asked, would any of these fraudulent priests have kept any kind of records or diaries, journals, anything like that?
Oh, I wish. I wish. Yeah, you know, it's so rare to find reference, because they're under the radar, right? They're sort of, you know, and actually the priests at Assumption often complained about even priests coming from Detroit would come across and sort of take advantage and say perform sacraments, because there's an income element, right? But no records that I found. There's the legitimate priests barely left records, so it would be fantastic to find more. But even in the bishop's papers, like I've seen references to men in the Archdiocese of Quebec. They come into Upper Canada, and then in Baltimore, in Kentucky, the same men, you can almost follow them because the bishops are talking about them. They're like, have you heard about McGilligan? Like, what's his story? And then, oh no, he's terrible, you know? So it's kind of cool, and it's something I'd love to do more on, but yeah, no, unfortunately, no records.
No direct records, but lots of information you found that really adds to the story.
I'd love to know who people who were baptized by these men. What did they?
Yeah.
Or married by them? Like, did they keep record of that? I don't know.
Yeah. One other question we had from John was, were the early Irish settlers Irish or Gaelic speaking? What language were they speaking?
They probably spoke both. But in Ireland at the time, depending on where they came from in Ireland, there's definitely a move toward Anglicization, and most of them would have spoken Irish, but would have understood English. They probably didn't write English, though actually something I didn't get a chance to talk about tonight. Most of the Assumption Irish can sign their names, or at least, you know, the prominent people who I showed are in the register quite frequently. They all can sign their names, so it suggests that they're illiterate. They are literate, sorry. But yeah, no, they would have probably done both. And the subject of Irish speaking in Ontario, at least, is something that is it's still almost a mystery, because it just disappears. There's very few references to people speaking Irish once they arrive in Canada. It's almost as though everyone just immediately switched to English. And it's something that, yeah, I think it just speaks to the fact that they're bilingual.
Okay. Someone commented that the 1800s social media grapevine would be what you could call the talk of all these fraudulent priests. Someone asked, how far would these priests have traveled?
That's a great question. They would have had fairly large areas. I'm trying to think of a good example. There's an example of a priest who was kind of hopping back and forth across the St. Lawrence, who was kind of ministering in some settlements in Eastern Ontario, and then would kind of pop over to upstate New York. So I think, you know, they kind of go where they can, but yeah, you see them, you hear about them in sort of one pocket of a place for you know, 2 or 3 months, and then they sort of move on. But yeah, no, they would have had, but I mean, legitimate priests had large jurisdictions as well, right? The priest, the example I always give is the priest who was stationed at Guelph in the early 1830s. He also had Dundas and Hamilton and all points in between, and he was expected to get between those places, and his horse gets stolen at one point, and he says, well, you know, how am I supposed to get around? He was forever getting beat up and things stolen from him. He had a terrible time. But yeah, like, they're already, you know, legitimate or not, they're covering huge areas, and it's entirely because the church does not have the resources to offer priests to every settlement.
Okay, let's see. Thank you for your great presentation. That comment has come up. Can you speak about the resources where we can find when our Irish ancestors came to Canada? You got any information on that would help?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's, you know, as I was saying, you know, in this assumption register, it's all about timing, right? So you almost have to figure out, find them in the census. You know, I'm sure there are genealogists in the audience who would have a better answer than this, but you kind of have to work backwards to figure out when they came. If you look at the handout, I've included a couple of databases that are from Library and Archives Canada, and the Gros Seal database in particular, I think might be of help if your ancestor came through Quebec. They would have had to stop at the quarantine station, and if somebody had been sick and unfortunately died, they would have been recorded there. And so that can be a way, and that database covers early 1830s into the 20th century. So that can be a great place. Unfortunately, it has to be someone has had to have died to find them there. The other database I included was Immigrants Before 1865, which is the one we're using for our Tracing Famine Generation project. And those, there's one of the largest parts of that database are these receipts that recorded immigrants who in 1843 to 1848 were given assistance by the government, provincial government. So not all immigrants would appear there because not all immigrants needed assistance. And by assistance, I mean food, medical treatment, transportation. But there are many, many names there. And what we're finding, at least in our project, is people came at different stages, right? There's this chain migration. Somebody might come out one year, send money back for the next person. And so somebody might appear in the database from your ancestor's family, maybe not the person you're looking for, but there might be a family member who appears. So those are some places to look. But again, I mean, I often, try to figure out the timing based on the census recording, like at the ages of the children and that sort of thing.
Okay. I don't have any other questions at this point in time. Linda, do you have anything?
No, I don't, but I've already seen Laura's presentation about that project and all the different resources that are available. I believe it's in our Library and Archives Canada, of all these, the people that charge the government because they're the ones that transported them from here to there and that kind of thing. I'm just not sure if there's if they've found any people that actually came this far west.
So I've only found one so far. And, it's kind of a weird story. So it's a young woman, her name is Winnie Hart. And maybe somebody, I keep doing these presentations and somebody in the audience says, oh, I know who that is, or I've researched that person. So maybe. Winnie Hart is 18 when she comes. I haven't managed to figure out if she had any family. Actually, no, she did. I'm wrong. But the reason why we know she ended up here was because she's sent to the Widows and Orphans Home in Toronto. And at the Widows and Orphans Home, they would indenture out widows and orphans. And so there's a register where they record where people were sent. These children are not being adopted. They're being sent to work in various places. And so it'll have someone's name and their address. But Winnie Hart was sent to Amherstburg and possibly with her sisters. And I haven't been able to find her since. She went to I'm going to forget the name now, but she went to the family of a minister. And it's funny because I really wanted to find out more about this, because this is far, right? Because we're not tracing people past London for the most part coming west. So I wanted to know more about her, but I discovered that there's a fictional account, that there's a fiction book written about the 19th century in Amherstburg, and she's a character in the book. So I was really kind of tickled by that, and also intrigued to know, what does the writer of this book know that I don't about Winnie Hart. But that was the first person, and you know what? It's likely there's more. We just haven't managed to find them yet.
Do you remember the name of the book? The fiction
Not
book?
off the top of my head, but I'm sure I have it in my notes somewhere. So I can send it. I can send it out if anyone.
Yeah, send
is
it to me.
interested.
I wouldn't mind looking for it myself.
Yeah, well, it's on. I believe I was able to read it online. Like it was an online book. So, but kind of cool, right? Like it's just they discuss this group, these three girls who are famine immigrants who are coming from Toronto any day now, and the Reverend has adopted them, and
Yeah, I know there's a lot of and descendants of Irish immigrants in Essex County now. Like I'm a descendant, but my Irish ancestor, he was as close as my grandfather, and he came in 1925, and then his wife and my mother came like a year later. But he always said he was Irish, and we all believed that. I mean, he had all these Irish traditions that he passed down to the whole family. But then when I started doing genealogy, surprisingly, I found out he was born in southern England. And the reason that I think he called himself Irish is because his father was born in Ireland. And I found his attestation papers from World War I, my grandfather's attestation papers. And he had written, again, he was almost like orphaned at this point. Both his parents had died. He joined the English Army at a very young age, and he wrote down that he was born in Dunmanway, County Cork, Ireland. So I know that's probably where his family comes from, but boy, they would call themselves Irish. I mean, all my aunts considered themselves Irish too, because it's a very strong tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all the more so in England. There's sort of
Right.
a concerted effort, like by necessity, but also on purpose, to kind of maintain the identity. It's sort of forced on them, but also they maybe want to do it. But yeah, no, that's super interesting. But yeah, speaking about, people coming at all times, this is the parish history of Maidstone. There are plenty of people in here that are Irish who came in the 1880s, and so it's this ongoing sort of influx. We have the people I talked about tonight, this core group that first settled, but it's constantly getting fed with more and more people. But for Irish immigration to Ontario, it sort of peters off by the end of the 19th century until sort of the late 20th century, which is when my family came from Ireland. And even now, the 21st century, there's been a massive influx of Irish, particularly to Toronto. But yeah, there's sort of these ebbs and flows, right? Like it changes over time. And it's interesting to me to see how it would be interesting for me at least to see how people interact with each other. Like, how do those people who came in the 1880s interact with the people who were 4 generations removed from Ireland? Like, did they all consider themselves Irish and in the same way, like, did they share cultural traditions? But those are things that people don't really talk about or leave records of, right?
Right. Well, I see we are past 8 o'clock, and if there are no more questions, I just want to thank Laura for this excellent presentation. It's been very interesting, very informative, and a whole new idea of fraudulent priests in the area. That's a whole new thing to think about. But just
Absolutely.
a reminder, we are taking our summer break, but we hope we'll see everybody at the OGS conference in June, at least virtually. And we hope everybody enjoys your summer. For my husband and I, that means going to lots of baseball games where our grandchildren are playing. We're going to be enjoying our golf course every week and relaxing at our trailer on Lake Huron. So all I can say is bye for now, stay safe, and keep doing genealogy. And there's a quote from George Bernard Shaw that I like. If you cannot get rid of the family skeleton, you may as well make it dance. And with that, I'll close the meeting and see you in September.
Thanks so much, Linda. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.